Usually when you're designing an application, there are other people involved, and because of that, you probably want to share your progress along the way. Now, sometimes you get to sit down and be face-to-face with the person who is helping you make decisions, but usually we have to send people stuff. We have to send them snapshots, so to speak, of our progress on something. And it's not necessarily when we're done. Sometimes it's along the way as well. And Sketch makes it very easy for us to take an artboard and share that entire artboard with the other people that need to see what we're doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the name of my first artboard here, which is called Player. And then on the inspector, I have an option that says Export. And when I click on Export, I get an option of creating a size for it. I get the option of creating a suffix at the end of my file name. And I get the option of choosing from these various file formats. So before we go too far, I just want to go through these file formats and make sure that you are all familiar with them. The PNG format is an uncompressed format for graphics. It's a standard format that's used on the web. It's a relatively small file. It's not too big, but it is a bigger file than a JPEG. And the idea is that whatever you see on your screen will be captured into the PNG without anything being changed. Nothing weird is going to happen. It's going to look exactly the same. JPEG, on the other hand, is compressed. JPEG files are smaller, but colors might shift. Gradients in color will be compressed, and you'll have fewer colors in that gradient. You'll end up with a phenomenon called banding. And JPEG is good, but it's not absolutely ideal. If you're dealing with a client or you're dealing with someone that you know is on a computer that, say, isn't a Mac, and you're not sure what's going to happen on their end if you send them a PNG, then feel free to send them a JPEG. It'll look okay, but a PNG would be the preferred option. PNGs also support transparency, so if you're exporting an object like a button or a circle or something that's just not in the shape of a square or a rectangle, then PNG would be the way to go because it retains its shape, it retains that transparent background, and it'll keep working as the button that you know and created. JPEG, on the other hand, JPEG must be a rectangle, so JPEG is not always the way to go. Now, PNG, JPEG, and TIFF, all three of these are considered raster images. It's turning your interface into a photograph. So it's not something you'd be able to go and fall back on if you lost your sketch file. It's something that is basically just a picture. It's almost like the better way of taking a photo of what you've done versus holding a camera up to your computer screen, which we all know would not look very good. Now, TIFF, that's another uncompressed file format. Some people prefer TIFF files. They're typically used for print. It's sort of the uncompressed print standard, whereas PNG is sort of the uncompressed web standard. TIFF files rarely come into play as part of a user interface workflow, but if someone requests a TIFF, then you know that you can do it. Now, PDF, EPS, and SVG, these are all formats that support vector graphics. So if you're trying to send someone something that they're going to scale up or that they're going to be editing in another application, say Adobe Illustrator or something like that, then you can choose from PDF, EPS, or SVG. Now, PDF is essentially the digital version of a printed sheet of paper, but it retains the vector nature of vector objects on one hand and text as well. So as those things get scaled up, they still look really good. They still look perfect. You can scale them infinitely because they're vector. Raster graphics, of course, stay raster, like my photograph of my album artwork here, but PDF will still retain the vector stuff as vector stuff. EPS is the closest thing that we have to actual Adobe Illustrator format. So if you're going over to someone who's not using Sketch, then EPS is a format that they'll be able to open and edit. And SVG, or Scalable Vector Graphic, that is the web standard for vector graphics. So if you're creating an icon or a logo or elements that are going to be used as vector graphics on the web, then you'll be using SVG to export your individual elements, not for your whole artboard, but for your individual elements like your buttons and stuff like that. So for our purposes, I'm going to stick with, I'm actually going to go with JPEG. I'm going to go with JPEG just to differentiate the JPEGs and the PNGs, because our individual assets, we're going to do PNGs, but for our artboards, I'll keep it simple. We'll do JPEGs, but just remember they're compressed and things can get a little bit shifty. Now, the other thing to know is that we can change the size. So if we want to export at a larger size or we want to export at a specific size, we do have that option. And it's kind of hinted down here, but not stated explicitly. You can use a multiplier by putting a number followed by the letter X. 3x would be 3 times the height, 3 times the width. Or you can type a number followed by W for width in pixels, or you can type it followed by H for the number of pixels in height. Now we've already got an established proportion for our artboard, so if we choose 512 pixels wide, it's going to figure out the appropriate height based on the proportions. Same goes for height. If we establish the height, it figures out the appropriate width based on the existing proportions. And you don't have to choose from this list. You can type whatever you want in here. And the reason there's still a plus sign at the top is we can export multiple versions. So I can hit the plus sign again, and I could say I want one at the regular size, and I want one at 2 times the size. And then it'll add at 2x to the end of the file name, which is a standard in web and software development. At 2x is used for Retina displays to load the assets that are 2 times larger for those Retina displays. There's also an X on the side, so I can clear out an export option that I don't want. And then I can select my second artboard, and I can do the same thing. I can choose export. I'll leave it at 1 times, and I'll switch it to JPEG format. So now that I have both of these ready for export, I can use the export button in the top right corner, the very last button on my toolbar, and I can export them both at the same time, which will allow me to choose where I'd like to save those. I can put them on the desktop, I can put them anywhere I want, and with JPEG you get to set the quality. This is essentially setting the compression. 100% is as uncompressed as possible, 0% looks pretty terrible, but it keeps the file size small. And it gives you a little blurb of text that reminds you of some of the things that we've talked about just now. JPEG does not support transparency, etc., etc. You'd want to do a PNG if you want to retain the transparency. And progressive determines how it loads, whether or not it loads top to bottom, or if it loads by progressively clearing up in quality. And then save for web discards information that is non-photographic information. For instance, creator and copyright and what device was used, what software was used to create it. All that non-photographic data gets discarded. It makes the files a tiny bit smaller too, so that can be useful. And that's all specific to JPEG, by the way. This is all specific to JPEG. So then I could choose export. But another trick I want to show you guys is if you have an artboard selected, or if you have several artboards selected and they are exportable, these little thumbnails that we see on the inspector are draggable. If I want to email someone this, or if I want to drop it into a message, I could click and drag it, and I could even drag it onto the mail icon, and it automatically opens mail and attaches it to my mail message. And this might look like it got bigger, but this was the original resolution that it was designed at, so this is actually the size it's supposed to be. And if I want to scale it down, the Mac Mail application allows me to scale it down at this point. But if I wanted to scale it down in Sketch, I could have done that on the inspector before I told it to export. So that's really neat. You can drag and drop either into another application, or you can drag and drop onto the desktop or into a folder, so you don't have to actually use the export button and go through that separate Finder window that comes up. You can just drag it where you want it. It's a really cool shortcut. So now let's look at exporting the individual assets, and let's look at a feature called slicing.